Hello, and welcome to Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate. Here's our host, Cherish Budzinski.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Exploring Intersections. This program is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Throughout this year, we're talking with expert panelists about some of the biggest social issues of our time. If you've missed our past programs, you can watch them on YouTube or download a podcast version. Today, our panel conversation centers on affordable housing. In the midst of a national housing crisis, skyrocketing rents, and limited inventory of affordable homes and apartments, many are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. What exactly is affordable housing? And what does housing justice look like? What solutions might we forge that would address the need for housing for all? To help us better understand today's topic, we are joined by three panelists. Christy Adams has been working in homeless services for more than a decade and currently serves as the Assistant Director at Humility Homes and Services Incorporated. Throughout her career, she has worked on case management, street outreach, and providing educational opportunities to the public about homelessness. She is responsible for the quality and management of 9 homeless service programs serving several counties in Illinois and Iowa. She is a graduate of Augustana College and has received specialized training from Org Code Counseling, a national leader in ending homelessness, and the Corporation for Supportive Housing, a national leader in permanent supportive housing. Her goal is to end homelessness in the greater Quad Cities area. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you, Cherish. Thank you for having me here today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Brenda Lee Norris is an associate of the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Chief Real Estate Officer of Metro West Housing Solutions, where she has worked for 14 years. It's an organization dedicated to providing affordable rental homes in Lakewood, Colorado. In addition to having a master's in business administration, she holds a housing development finance professional designation from the National Development Council, a certified housing asset management designation from the Consortium for Housing and Asset Management, and is a licensed Colorado real estate broker. She is a current member of the Strategic Housing Working Group of the Colorado Division of Housing and is a frequent speaker at local and national housing conferences. Welcome, Bren.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here today.
And Sister Barbara Bush is a member of the Sisters of Charity, and she is the founder and executive director of Working in Neighborhoods. For 40 years, she has worked to help low and moderate income residents shape their communities. Sister Barb has provided leadership training for grassroots neighbors to speak effectively with financial industry leaders and elected officials about the needs of their communities. WIN has built or rehabilitated and sold 168 homes to first-time homeowners. And the work of WIN to develop relationships with lenders has resulted in more than 7,000 low-income families owning their homes. WIN has saved more than 1,500 families from foreclosure with an economic impact of homes saved from foreclosure of $167 million. Welcome, Sister Barbara.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here today.
So let's start the conversation first by learning more about how each of you became interested in the issue of affordable housing and why it's important to you. Sister Barb, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I would say there's probably 2 reasons. One is that I grew up with a hereditary history of carpenters. So I like sawdust. That's one of those things that kind of comes with growing up in the family. And I worked for Catholic Social Services for a number of years. And in that, I was doing some counseling in one of our low-income neighborhoods and discovered that over 55 families were going to lose their home because of an FHA program that didn't actually look at the homes and kept reselling them. And we had one 65-year-old couple who actually bought a house the first time in their lives and were so happy. Had a dog in the backyard and fenced it in, and the termites ate through the wallpaper within 3 months.
Wow.
So I became very interested in how we were going to make sure that people could stay in their homes.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Christy, how about you? How did you get interested in this topic?
I would say that I was really initially interested in homeless services and spent the early part of my career doing direct service. It wasn't until I got into some management positions that I really learned that you can't really be concerned about the homelessness crisis in our community without also being very concerned about the affordable housing crisis, that they are in fact the same problem. So I think that my interest in homelessness services just led me directly down a path to the affordable housing crisis.
And Bren, how about you? Or Bree, sorry.
No,
Bren. Brenda Lee.
I know it's a complicated name. So when I graduated from college, I moved to Chicago for a year as I was contemplating entering religious life. And during that time, I volunteered in a homeless shelter. So like Christy had some direct hands-on experience with that. And when I entered my community, traditionally my community was a teaching community, and I was definitely not a teacher, and which I think is better for everyone. So, but having said that, since I didn't fit the kind of traditional path of what folks did when they entered my community, they said, well, why don't you find what you want to do? And fortunately for me, I had the experience of meeting a Sister of Mercy who ran a small affordable housing development program in Des Moines, Iowa. And when I first met her, I was talking about having volunteered at this homeless shelter, and the first words out of her mouth were, that's not a solution. And I thought, she's right. So it's like Christy said, it's two sides of a coin. And that really struck me. And I just have such a fundamental belief that home is a core value and at the base of everything else in our lives. And so I got involved and have never left the industry.
Wonderful. And what does homelessness look like right now in this country, as well as how did it look historically? Christy, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, we are seeing a current rise in homelessness and have over the last several years. The point in time count, which is a federal tool that most homeless service providers in their communities use to count people who are unsheltered on a single night. So it's literally a point in time that we are counting people, has demonstrated in the last year that there has been an increase. So what the climate looks right now is that we're headed in some ways in the wrong direction in our country. Prior to that, we had seen 4 years of a decline in homelessness in our country. And now it's sort of the barometer is headed in the other direction, which is problematic, obviously. I think it's important when we're talking about what it looks like historically to acknowledge the fact that what homelessness looks like in our country now did not always exist. The problem sometimes seems overwhelming to individuals. And I think that we really miss out on a piece of education that can make the problem seem more solvable just by recognizing that it has not always been like this in our country, that there were some really specific policies that changed the landscape of access to housing and the housing stock available, starting kind of in the 80s with reductions in what a lot of people would call the projects, which are just affordable housing units. So we tore a lot of those down in our country and we didn't reinvest in the right ways. And so we started losing a lot of affordable units, which then caused people to enter the homelessness system at a much higher rate. So sort of this this catastrophic visual representation of homelessness that you can see in most parts of our country right now. If we really think about it, it's new, which means that we can fix it because it doesn't need to be like that anymore. And I think that's an important historical point that we should always remind each other of, especially those of us in this work every day.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Bren, any additional thoughts on that, how it's looked historically and how homelessness looks today?
Sure. Christy mentioned the decade of the 1980s, and not only was housing being torn down, but simultaneously the budget at HUD was being slashed for building new housing. So throughout the decade of the 1980s, the HUD budget actually was cut by 86%. So clearly unable to continue to build at anywhere near the rate that we used to build. So there was just less availability. The other thing I would say is that right around that time was also when we did the deinstitutionalizing of people with mental health issues. And so that happened, and I think a lot of the institutions were bad and needed to be deinstitutionalized, but there was no backup plan. So people essentially ended up on the streets. And so I think what we see now is people who are unhoused, unsheltered tend to have much more than the broader population incidence of mental health issues, addiction issues, some of those things. Although right now, as Christy said, it's bad economically. So we're seeing a lot more just pure economic homelessness.
Mm-hmm. And Sister Barb, any additional thoughts on how homelessness has looked historically compared to today?
Sure. The one thing that they have not said is that we now see many more families who are homeless than we saw in my early days in the field. It was more the questions of some folks who were out of institutions, some addiction, and some folks who just didn't feel like they fit in. And I know when I started at Catholic Charities with 40 alcoholic families. And of those, about 30 were single men who would, they would spend the summer outside, and then they would get put into the workhouse. They would find a way to get into the workhouse for the winter. We can't even think about doing something like that because we have no place to put people today. But today we're really seeing in the economic piece, lots of families living in cars and lots of families being grateful they have a car.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the human costs of the lack of affordable housing that we're experiencing? And what are the societal costs of this crisis? Sister Barb?
Sure. Well, I think realistically, particularly for families, children who don't have stability fall back in their education. And there's no way, even if you have a shelter that you're living in, it's very hard in a shelter to do homework, to spend, and not that the shelters don't try to do that stuff, but there are very few family shelters. There are very few opportunities for those kids to go out and play and do different things and not be worried about where they're going to be and whether they're going to be with mom and dad. There's very often not an ability to have a mixed couple with the kids. So to me, that's a big human cost. I'd say the other human cost is war. We've seen because we've had many more people who've gone to war over the last 12, 16, 20 years than we had in the past. We see way more veterans out on the street than were there before. And,
Wow.
and that's the whole livelihood thing of people who could and would have traditionally been able to make a living for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Christy, your thoughts on the human costs and societal costs of this crisis?
Yeah, I think the real human cost is that we know that people who experience being unhoused or homeless die at much higher rates, have higher mortality rates than the rest of us do. And I know for my direct line staff, that is something that always weighs on them, that the hurriedness of getting somebody housed can literally save their life. So that's a human cost. There is a real human behind those statistics. I think the other economic cost is that what a lot of times people don't realize is that living unsheltered is expensive. It's expensive on other systems, because a lot of times if you're living unsheltered, you have poor access or infrequent and chaotic access to things like food and clothing, and obviously shelter, which oftentimes results in people frequenting emergency room departments for basic healthcare needs. It oftentimes results in people getting charged with crimes that are a direct result of their inability to have a home. So things like urinating in public, or public intox, for example, or trespassing. So they're spending far more nights in jail than our average person would. And all of that is an additional cost on society that can be mitigated by the easy solution of housing. So there are real human costs to the actual individual who is unsheltered, and there are other human costs to the rest of us to support those individuals who are living unsheltered.
Mm-hmm. And Bren, your thoughts on the human costs as well as the societal costs?
Sure. I think Sister Barb and Christy spoke very well about the human costs, and I experience and support what they say. One of the other economic costs that we talk a lot about is that if we don't have affordable housing close to employment, that employers can't find employees, and it just makes for a worse cycle. So the whole economy suffers if we can't house people where they can work or close to where they can work. So that's a big push when we're trying to work with local communities in particular, to accept affordable housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're hearing a lot about that in the news now, that employers are having a hard time finding employees for certain roles. So it's important to note that. Bren, let's stay with you for this one. How tight is the market for affordable rentals and homes in your experience, and what factors are coming into play to complicate that issue?
It's very tight. For example, I develop affordable housing. So as of yesterday, we started moving new families into an apartment community that we just got built. It's 65 apartments, and we had opened the wait list for people to apply to get in for 3 days in September, and we got over 500, close to 600 applicants for 65 apartments. All of our communities have wait lists of hundreds of people. And where I work, we also run the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program for the city. We have usually 2,000 to 3,000 people on the wait list to get a voucher. And we have about 1,000 vouchers at any given time, but any given year, we maybe can take 100 people off the wait list. So there's a critical shortage, and that's just in my small community in Colorado, and you multiply that across the country, we're millions of homes short, and especially at the lowest income levels.
Yeah, so that's the reality of the situation. Sister Barb, in your experience, how tight is the market?
I'll agree with the others, but the thing that also is extraordinarily tight is the single family for working folks. The cost of that, we're looking in less than a year at a 30% increase in purchase price, which takes a lot of working families out of the ability to purchase. The other thing we're seeing is out-of-town investors buying up single family housing. So there is no opportunity to actually purchase a home, which, unless you've got a lot of money, and which then means that they're still in apartments that aren't available to people who don't have shelter. So you have to, it's a continuum. We want to see people off the street and in at least a shelter, or preferably a permanent situation. And then we want to be able to move people through from an apartment into an apartment that's a little nicer as time goes on, and maybe into home ownership if they choose to do that. But when you cut off at either end the ability, you're kind of in a position where that there is a greater and greater need. And then the other thing is we can't build our way out of it because the cost has gone up on our units, because I build and rehab and sell. Our single family units we used to be able to do a gap of $40,000. Our gaps now look at closer to 70,000 because of the cost of steel, of lumber, and the lack of construction people.
Yeah, absolutely. So many other factors that are feeding into this problem. Christy, how tight is the market in your experience for affordable housing? And I know this has an impact on the work that you and your colleagues do. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I love to give this story because I think it just really highlights the crisis. So we have a team of wonderful case managers who work one-on-one with participants to help get them rehoused. And a lot of that work is just scouring Craigslist and other available online resources for housing. It's also in large part building as many relationships as possible with community landlords, because we are desperate for every available unit. What sometimes happens, and I think just really draws attention to this issue specifically, is that it's so competitive that even within our own team, we have staff who will hoard contacts with landlords because it's that important to them. They know that if that landlord has that relationship with them, then they can get their participants potentially housed more quickly. Or another example would be an available affordable unit comes online on Craigslist, and our team is just like, to the landlord and to the listing, trying to navigate who's going to take that, because we have that many people competing for one unit. Here in the Quad Cities region, which includes some cities on the Illinois side of the Mississippi and some cities on the Iowa side of the Mississippi. So we're a bi-state region here, and it's called the Quad Cities for those of you that don't know. Since 2010, we have lost 30% of our affordable units in our community here through either them being renovated and turned over to market rate, whether they've been torn down, or whether people have just been priced out of them. So understanding the scope, just even within our small Midwest community, of the lack that exists. I mean, 30% is an astonishing number.
And it's so telling that there's competition among your coworkers. It's so telling.
Healthy and good. But yes.
All in the spirit of helping humankind. But
that's right.
Christy, let's stay with you for this at first. What are some of the misconceptions about homelessness, and what are the real barriers to housing for the chronically homeless?
Yeah, I could probably spend the rest of this time talking about the misconceptions related to people who are experiencing homelessness. But I think the one that I'll highlight for today's conversation, and again, I'm going to use another analogy, which is basically what people sometimes, I think, conceptualize, is that if we just get this person connected to the right services, that will be enough. And that is a large part of what needs to happen for a lot of people who have found themselves unsheltered. They need reconnected to their communities through a variety of mechanisms. But if we think about homelessness like think about a bathtub, for example, right? So I stated earlier in this conversation that the rates of homelessness are increasing in our country. So essentially we have turned the faucet on. So because of policies and other economic factors and things like racism, we are dumping people into the homelessness system at a higher rate than we should be. And in addition to that, we are plugging the drain at the bottom. The drain is getting clogged because we are losing all of these affordable units. So the bathtub is getting full, and in many communities has overflowed and is running all over the house. And that's not due to a lack of services. That's due to a lack of housing. So the services are astronomically important for the person's eventual stability in their housing, but the services don't necessarily create the housing. So without people like Sister Barbara and Brenda Lee, who are doing the housing development on the back end, and our organization is working on that as well, it's sort of a different scale. There's no amount of rental assistance and subsidies and services that are going to get us out of this dilemma without increasing the affordable housing units. So we get, as a direct service provider, we sometimes get a lot of pressure about making sure that we have enough capacity, for example, within our shelter to serve the need. But that capacity will probably continue to need to grow unless we address the clogged drain, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the biggest misconception, really. We have to invest in affordable housing, or there will be no other alternative but to continue to see the homelessness crisis increase in our community. It will become visible in communities where it's not visible now.
And I see that in Tucson. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I see it just driving down the main road to my house. There are people living in tents in essentially what's a dry riverbed. Bren, your thoughts on some of the misconceptions, any that you would like to put to rest, and what are the real barriers to housing that you're seeing?
I fully support what Christy said about the lack of affordable housing being the big issue. But another misconception that I frequently hear is that people want to be homeless. They don't want to go to housing. And that's just not the case. I mean, people don't want to live in the snow out on the street. So I think addressing that misconception goes a long way toward helping people not just dismiss that these are human beings who aren't choosing this situation. And I think, again, the barriers, the lack of housing, but then in some cases, barriers are as simple as helping someone get an ID so they can run a background check. So there are some barriers we're able to overcome, and some that are going to take billions of dollars to build. And when we talk about the lack of available housing, it in fact is kind of across the spectrum from affordable through high end, because we're short on high end housing, and that means people who ordinarily would buy that are occupying the middle income housing, so the middle income people can't occupy that, and so it kind of trickles all the way through. So that's a barrier. We're just short of housing units, and we're not building at any level fast enough to keep up with the need.
Absolutely. And of course, there are incentives for developers to build higher end housing, which is the ability to turn a substantial profit. And it's a little more difficult to do that with affordable housing solutions. Sister Barb, any misconceptions that you would like to debunk about homelessness and the real barriers that you've seen? I think your microphone might be on mute.
Sorry about that. Most people probably don't know that we're really one paycheck away from becoming homeless. And so during this pandemic, what we're seeing now is so many families who are losing their apartments, who are going to get into foreclosure, and we're going to see this crisis all over again because the jobs aren't there. And I think most people do not understand the number of people who are just like us. They're not different. They don't have massive problems necessarily. Some do, but an awful lot today are families who have had one or two kinds of financial mishaps that don't allow them to live in the house that they, or the apartment that they lived in the past. And so they don't have options. And in low income communities, we lost so many during the 2008 foreclosure, where they really tore down a number of homes after that, which then means that even families who used to get together and take care of each other, the many members of families are out and out together, so that there really isn't a place, where people for a while were going home to moms or going home to their brothers, or that kind of stuff is pretty well sewed up. As she said, the bathtub is pretty much just clogged.
Mm-hmm. What solutions to the housing crisis are you exploring through your work? Sister Barb, let's start with you on that one.
Well, I think one thing we're trying to do is, of course, educate people about, what are the causes, how we can all participate. I've been working a lot with a number of community leaders looking at how do we create dollars to build. And so, we're trying to get corporations and banks and of course we want government, but that is always up in the air, how much money there is available, but trying to get a broader support so that there is an opportunity to even think about building more housing than we are right now, and trying to help understand the fact that the biggest way that we can build a permanent supportive housing is really at this point through the tax credits. And so, we're in hopes that they will expand them, because there's only a certain number you're allowed to have in your state, and then it's gone. So, the best intentions don't get us to where we need to be. And the other thing that we've been supporting is there is a desire to get developers tax credits also, so that they can build single family, smaller homes and get a credit for the gap between their sale price, which would then put more people into the building market.
Mm-hmm. Great. What solutions to the housing crisis are you exploring through your work, Bren?
We do also a lot of education and advocacy, as Sister Barb does. We do quite a bit of advocacy with our elected officials. And, I'll talk about this at the end with my action item, but there is federal legislation that could make a huge difference. Always money, money, money. But there are some other things we do explore. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to build more efficiently and looking at technologies around that. So we tend to do on-site construction. So the framing and everything is done on-site, but we're continuing to explore buying modular units that can be stacked. So they're assembled in factories where there's less waste, there's better quality control, and some of those things, and constantly looking at ways we can be more efficient in what we build. And in spite of all that, as we've talked about, the prices continue to skyrocket, and it's it's an immigration issue on labor, it's supply chain issues all over the board. So that we're trying to be as creative as possible. The other areas we're looking at creatively are around what are the regulatory barriers that make things more expensive? So zoning issues and tap fees, what you have to pay to get water and sewer onto your property. Looking at some of those issues and how municipalities or whatever areas might be able to help lower the costs or provide some help to in those arenas.
It's such a complex issue. Christy, what solutions to the housing crisis are you exploring?
Yeah, I would definitely echo what the other two panelists said, as well as much advocacy to your elected officials, both local and national, as possible. In our community, we are in a position where we have a lot of momentum right now. And I really attribute that to a plan that the Quad City Housing Council put together, along with a slew of community partners that we deemed the Silos to Solutions plan. But essentially what it did was coalesce our community around defining what the actual problem was in our specific community. Probably, as the panelists and I are all aware of, and now maybe several of the people listening today, the problem is complicated and it can be very confusing. And so spending the time with the whole community, identifying exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about what affordable housing is and how to grow affordable housing, and then establishing a plan that the entire community can wrap itself around, I think is probably one of the most important steps. I know if we can do it across 2 states with 4, 5 cities, then it's possible in other communities. And so I would really encourage people to work, as cliche as that sounds, but really get down to the nitty gritty about what the problem is and how to resolve it within your own community.
Fascinating. With this group and these discussions, we're always looking to better understand intersectional issues. How does the issue of affordable housing intersect with racism, migration, and climate change? Sister Barb, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, on the racism issue, if we look historically, the country actually legislated against communities of color, particularly African Americans, from purchase. So FHA, which was one of the ways in which most people were able to buy a house, and VA, both drew red lines around neighborhoods that were majority African American, majority Latinx, and some of the lower income white communities, and actually told lenders they were not allowed to lend because they would not, you could not get an FHA loan, you could not get a VA loan. People coming back from war couldn't get a VA loan if they were African American. So there's a history of preventing wealth creation in the minority communities that was actually legislated. And it wasn't until 1965, 66, 67 that the legislation allowed for families and got changed. But there were actually integrated housing projects that were torn down, and then a housing project was created for a white family, and then a brown housing project, and then an African American, so that they wouldn't touch each other. And so even in the rental market, we actually legislated people out of opportunity, which really is frightening when you think about it. And if anybody's interested and wants to look at The Color of Law, it is probably one of the best books related to actual research on how we actually made it impossible for minority families to create wealth. And so we're looking at that now because we've got so many low-income communities of color that are not there because people weren't working hard, but they're there because we actually created the legislation that did that. And I think the other large piece to this is our own fear of each other. And so I think that's one of the things that, people are afraid of people they don't know. And we have to, I think, work hard not to be that way. The other thing is those low income communities also use more energy, because you got to be thinking in terms of the climate. But what happens is that your heat goes out when a house is not well insulated, when it's not a tight envelope. And so in terms of climate, we actually both see people's health, individual families' health go bad, but also we are actually creating our own problems by not doing quality housing in low-income communities. So if you want to look at those kinds of things, we really, and then our fear of each other in migration is really a way in which we don't actually bring in people who could help us build homes. Because many of the minority communities actually do a lot of construction and have all their lives and have the skill, which we are holding back from.
Fascinating. Bren, your thoughts on our intersectional issues? How does affordable housing, or the lack thereof, intersect with racism, migration, and climate?
Sure. Yeah, racism plays right into people not having housing, even to today. I mean, the law is there, but the reality is that people are still discriminated against. And, we kind of wax and wane in the enforcement of regulation. So there was put forth in the Obama administration the affirmatively furthering fair housing expectation through HUD. And the Trump administration said, we're not going to enforce this. And now the Biden administration is saying, we are going to enforce this. So it's ping pong back and forth of whether, we have this on the books, but are we really going to do anything about it? So that's a problem. Thinking about climate change, I have a couple of thoughts. One is that lower income communities are certainly less resilient. As Sister Barb said, the buildings frequently aren't as good, but also are in areas that are more affected by severe climate events. And so that is a real issue in terms of housing equity and looking at where people are able to live that won't be as immediately affected with these climate events. The other thing I would say is that we spend a lot of focus on how to make buildings more efficient. So Sister Barb talked about the building envelope and all of that, because buildings contribute to global warming. Something like 30 to 40% of the contribution to the gases of global warming are because of buildings, residential buildings. So everything we can do to make them more efficient is going to help everybody, including the residents of our buildings, and they'll have healthier air quality and all of the things that give people a better quality of life. Again, we experience the same problems with lack of workforce and and by birth in the United States, we're not going to keep up. We need to have our borders open to immigration. We need people to come from other parts of the world for all sorts of jobs, but construction in particular in the arena in which I work.
A thought that I would like to add to that is there was a news story just this week about an African-American couple in California who had their home appraised for sale and then essentially erased themselves from the home. And the appraisal came in $500,000 higher.
Absolutely.
So we're talking also about an impact on generational wealth from the racism perspective as well. Christy, your thoughts on these intersectional issues, racism, migration, and climate?
Yeah, I think the other two panelists did a great job highlighting the big picture things. Two things that come to mind for me, kind of adding on to what they had to say, is that not only is there discrimination in housing, but there's discrimination once the person loses the housing as well. So the amount of systems that one needs to navigate to often get back out of the homelessness system are very frequently government entities. therefore also legislated by the same policies that potentially where they met discrimination in their housing, they also may continue to meet it once they're homeless. So there is also both sides of that happening too. I might lose my housing because of discrimination, and I might be unable to get rehoused again because I have to navigate all of these other systems that have historically been designed to keep people in the system and not get them out, right? So that's sort of just in addition to what Sister Barbara said. And then the other thing about quality housing, affordable housing, is that utility costs are astronomical and they're only going up. So our organization is in the purchasing of affordable units or the purchasing of units for us to make affordable, so that our organization continues to combat the lack of affordable housing in our community. One of the things we're starting to do and really look at is potentially getting solar panels on the majority of our properties, in an effort to reduce our costs, in an effort to reduce the tenants' costs, so that people can stay more stably housed. So it's all included in the conversation, basically.
That is such an innovative solution, and such a great intersectional topic with climate change. As always, we welcome questions from our live audience, and we do have one that's come in, and I'll throw this out to anyone who feels like they have some thoughts on it. The question is, how does the low minimum wage play a role in this crisis?
It's definitely huge. Families can't, that is really how come families cannot move up at all. And many of our families work 2-3 jobs or work a lot of overtime, which makes a difference in families. And so the minimum wage, in my opinion, is one of the leading causes of families not being able to house themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would also add that sometimes we joke that we got into social work because we were so bad at math class, right, in high school. That's why we're all doing this now. But I encourage people to sit down and just do the basic math in your own community. Like literally calculate minimum wage once taxes are gone. Get on Craigslist and find a unit that you think you'd want to live in and try to make those numbers work for yourself. You will find very quickly that you cannot make those numbers work in pretty much any community in the United States. You can't make the math make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the education pieces we do is we'll say, this is the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment. And this is how many hours you would have to work at minimum wage to afford that apartment. Yeah. And, it's hundreds of hours a week or whatever. And so, yeah, I think an interesting outcome of the pandemic so far, at least in the Denver area where I am, is that there is a minimum wage, but because the places are so short of workers, almost everywhere is paying above the minimum wage just to be able to hire people. So I think the published minimum wage certainly has a big impact, but right now the reality is people are getting paid more than that, which I guess is a good outcome for a bad issue.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from our audience. This is a really great question. How can we encourage communities to welcome affordable housing developments? Are there collective benefits that we can communicate to do that?
We spend a lot of time on this issue because in no neighborhood ever did they say, please bring a bunch of poor people and put them in my backyard. So our focus has always been, we build beautiful housing that is indistinguishable from the neighborhood. And so when you provide quality and maintain it very well, neighborhoods are more open to that. And then as we've built some history, we've actually helped turn neighbors from hating us to loving us, or at least tolerating us. And then some of those neighbors will talk to other neighbors. We'll say, we're going into this neighborhood. Do you know anybody? Yeah, I'll talk to them. We'll tell them how much this helped. And so a lot of it is just the experience. And we'll say, come and see, walk through what we've built, see how we manage it. And that helps a lot to dispel some of the myths about what affordable housing is.
Mhm. Great. We have another question from our audience. Are any of you aware of statistics regarding the number of elderly living alone in the family home, where many more could be housed if there were some independent living choices for them? Does that fall into any of your areas of expertise? I have read that boomers are staying in their homes longer, and that's part of the housing crisis that we're experiencing.
Yeah, I don't have any statistics on like how many people are living sort of in that situation. I do have a lot of information specifically about the aging population entering the homelessness system at much faster rates than previously, and that is a result of the baby boomers aging. So we also in the system currently have a much higher percentage of people who are older. And that comes along with a whole other set of issues in getting people rehoused. So getting people reconnected to supported living in some way, assisted living in some way, nursing home care in some way, reconnected with family. Those are really nuanced challenges to the elder population in the homelessness system. I can only imagine that that's probably also replicated in people who are housed and living that way as well. And so I'm sure there's a lot of empty bedrooms out there.
And there are some programs, at least if pilot programs or small groups working to marry up people who are looking for a place to live and people like who are elderly and would like to have someone staying in their house with them. Almost, if you think of the Golden Girls back then, you know, there are companies that will be matchmaker like that. They're not big, but it would be a help if that was something that grew, because I think it helps on both sides, as Christy said, because someone could possibly stay in their home longer if they had a roommate helping with costs or some of those things.
We spend a lot of time helping people stay in their home. And the reason for it is that that's where they want to be. That's where neighbors who take care of them are. That's where, you know, I went to church and I know these folks. And so if I need something, I can call somebody. If I move out, and then the other real thing is most of our folks who live on Social Security alone do not have the money to go into assisted living or to move. That, you know, they've traditionally owned their home and they're dealing with that the cost of not having rent, not having a mortgage. They do have, of course, utilities and other costs, but their income fits that much more closely than it would to move into a retirement community. And there are no real retirement communities, at least in Cincinnati, Ohio, or assisted living for folks who are just on a basic Social Security income. So we spend a lot of time rehabbing those homes and helping them to stay in and doing accessibility in order to keep them in their home and in their environment. And, you know, what they say to me is, my sister moved into a nursing home and she died 20 years ago and I'm still alive. So there's also the real reality of life that people like to have their own space. And, you know, they deserve to be able to keep their own home.
Yeah, it's a difficult transition too. So we can acknowledge that as well. What about tiny houses? This was a question from an audience member. What are some of the implications of that? Is that a viable solution that anybody's exploring?
Yeah, I think that they are cool. And And I think that they are a solution along a spectrum of solutions. I think that what my opinion is, generally speaking, is that sometimes they're talked about as the solution. And I just would encourage the audience to consider why we shouldn't be putting people into housing that the rest of us are in, instead of relegating them to the singular choice of a tiny house. So again, I think it is a solution in some communities. We have found in ours in the Midwest, with as cold as it gets, that they're not that much cheaper ultimately to operate and build and everything else than potentially purchasing units that are already online and rehabbing them. So yeah, a possible solution. One of the things that I know our team really likes about the idea is the community that gets built around them oftentimes. And for people who have lived unsheltered for a long time, that are very isolated, that would be very appealing. But I think that can also be created in most other, housing situations as well. So yeah.
So one of many options. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, sort of an offshoot of tiny homes is accessory dwelling units, and that's being pushed a lot in Denver. And that's where, if you have, say, a 2-car garage on your property, maybe you convert it to be a rental unit and you can rent that, or you build a tiny home in your backyard or something, so that on a single family lot you can fit 2 homes, and then you have the potential, at least, for more people to be in homes in the same amount of space. But again, it's one small piece to a much larger puzzle.
Absolutely.
The other thing that in low-income communities, there are tiny homes. I've rehabbed, in fact, I'm rehabbing right now a 509 square foot home. So, we're not into building them because, I laughed. Some guy got a big project to build them in downtown Cincinnati. And the cost of building the tiny homes to fit into to that neighborhood was $125,000. Now, in my mind, I would rather renovate a 509 foot square unit than build and use that much of the financial resources. But who usually likes them, honestly, is younger folks. And that's okay. I mean, I don't have any problem with that, but I don't think it's the solution to homelessness.
Right. Great. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone in our audience who submitted questions for our panelists. Those were some great questions, and we're sorry we're not able to get to all of them. However, we welcome you to continue the conversation on our Facebook page. So with a better understanding of the topic of affordable housing, it's time to talk about next steps. Each of our panelists have provided a suggested action item to help us as we move forward. Christy, tell us about your action item.
So my action item for the audience today is to contact your local representatives and advocate for better investments into your local housing trust fund. Everyone should have one of these in your community, so it's accessible to everybody, and it is designed to build and develop affordable housing. So the more investment that we can put into the housing trust fund, the more likely that your individual community can bulk up the investment in your neighborhood. So that is my action item for today.
Great. Sister Barbara, tell us about your action item.
Sure. I'd asked you to call your elected officials to provide down payment assistance for first-time home buyers, particularly in communities of color, because if we could lower the cost of the house, a lot of people could own, and we could change the wealth, the lack of wealth in African-American and minority communities if they could start owning and start building in their own communities. So, and there is some legislation out there, and HUD is considering adding down payment assistance. So if you know and talk to or would write to or call your elected officials and encourage down payment assistance money to give people an opportunity to begin to build wealth of their own.
Wonderful. And Bren, tell us about your action item.
Right now, I would like to ask people to contact your senators from your state and ask them to vote in favor of the Build Back Better Act. So this is national legislation I'm sure everyone has heard about, but it has important housing implications as well as a number of things that would support people in general. It adds $25 billion of additional rental assistance, for example, additional $65 billion to preserve public housing, an additional $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund. So like Christy was talking about, local housing trust funds. And the House has already passed this legislation. It is at the Senate now, and the Senate is scheduled, or will be hopefully scheduled, to take up a vote on this before the holiday recess. So it's important to get to the senators now and ask them to support this and not to so cut it back that it can't contain what we need to help with housing and other issues.
Great. Thank you for those calls to action. And most of all, thank you all for sharing your expertise and your thoughts on affordable housing. It was really an eye-opening conversation. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you also to the incredible team of professionals working behind the scenes to bring this program to life every month. Next month on Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate, we discuss education justice. What barriers do we need to overcome to allow students to thrive in our education system? How do intolerance, segregation, and inequities in education harm us all? And what does education justice look like? We'll explore those topics and much more in our next conversation. That's January 12th, 2022. We hope you'll join us. Thank you for being here today. This series is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Visit our website, exploringintersections.org, to find resources mentioned in today's conversation, or to register to attend our next program. We broadcast live every second Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. You can also download podcasts of our panel discussions from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or via our website. And be sure to connect with us for the continuing conversation on Facebook. I'm Cherish Badzinski, and thanks for tuning in to Exploring Intersections.